All right, well, it is almost 3 days before the 6th Democratic local elections to be held on Monday, the 1st of November. For the first time, the IEC has registered a record number of close to 1,500 independent candidates. An organization called One South Africa Movement, led by former leader of the Democratic Alliance, Mmusi Maimane, has been established and claims to seek to wrestle power from political parties back to communities during these upcoming elections. Now, the big question is, does this mark a gradual shift in local politics in South Africa? To help us discuss and certainly unpack this issue is Tessa Dooms, a political analyst who is also doing some work for the United Nations Development Program during these elections. A very good afternoon to you, Tessa. Such a great pleasure to have you here on SABC News with us again.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to talk firstly, before we get into the issue of independent candidates, let's talk about some of the work that you're doing with the United Nations. Certainly, they've been very much involved in these elections. Perhaps you can talk to us about what you've been up to. I know that they've been very involved in terms of voter education, for example.
Yeah, the United Nations Development Program has a mandate about championing governance across the world. And really in South Africa, we have the privilege of having an office in this country that is very committed to on-the-ground work and work in communities and work with organizations in the country. For this election, there's been a clear focus on civic education, electoral education, voter education, because we recognize that particularly when it comes to local government, but even in general with elections, we don't really talk enough about what our votes mean. And we don't really talk about what the mechanisms are for accountability and the usefulness of our vote after we make that X. And so part of the work that we're doing is to really give people an opportunity to have people who are not contesting for power that can engage on what is the meaning of this vote, what does it enable us to do as a country once we've elected representatives, what is our role beyond that. And we want to encourage more democratic participation in this country in the years to come. We know that elections and electoral participation has been waning, and we certainly want to make sure that people are making informed choices about whether they vote, whether they don't, but that they're making informed choices and they understand what happens in a democracy and how they can best contribute to it.
Yeah, and when we're talking about voter education, of course, South Africans are starting to understand the issue of independent candidates and how that works. Do you think there's enough education around independent candidates at this time? I mean, the IEC is saying that they have a record number, close to 1,500 candidates, independent candidates. And what do you think triggered the surge in having so many independent candidates for these elections? And the second part of that question is, do you see that as being the route that South Africa is taking when it comes to local government?
Yeah, certainly it's going to go far beyond local government when it comes to independent candidates, given that we know last year the Court ruled that independent candidates will be able to, and Parliament must ensure that independent candidates are able to contest in national and provincial elections. Yeah. But really there are two root causes for the surge in independent candidates. One is the waning number of voters that have been coming to the polls from one election to the next. We've seen that people are seeing a gap and an opportunity to get people who have become disinterested, disillusioned, and not willing to come to the polls because they don't trust the candidates and the parties and the options, and really give them an alternative. And the second thing is really also about having politics that's closer to communities and where people can really engage with politicians. Unfortunately, when you start having quite large parties that dominate the political space, and large personalities that dominate the political space, oftentimes communities don't actually get to interact with the political leaders that they see on television, that they know are acting in the national terrain. And in the last national election, we saw this boom in the number of parties that were contesting, a boom in smaller parties that were contesting. And even though all of those didn't make it into parliament, it showed an appetite that people have for parties that are close to where they are, people who they can interact with directly, and people who they believe they can hold accountable. And I think that's what is boosting independent candidates which we really haven't seen much of in the past, even though it's been possible at local government level.
Yeah, and let's talk about how much power and influence these independents carry in local government system. We've been, obviously, as the IFP spokesperson was saying just before we crossed you, that in the clip they're saying that, it's silly season when it comes to elections, and certainly a lot of bizarre things being said by political parties in attempts to woo voters. But some of the political parties have been saying, there's no point. You're wasting your vote when you're voting for an independent candidate or one of the smaller parties. And I wonder, is there any truth to that?
Particularly not in the local government elections context. That is just an untruth.
Yeah.
The ward councillors, whether they are PR or the direct ward councillor, really are community representatives before they are party representatives. And it is their job to lobby for the issues of their community. And when they get into the council space, it is their job, whether they're independents or they're affiliated to a party, they are being elected as individuals. And so it's their job to find ways to lobby the interests of their community, to use their political skill, to find people who care about the same issues that they do, to go into those budget processes and make sure that the IDP reflects the issues of their community, to make sure that the budget gets passed so that their community is going to get the services. And so the fact that you are rooted in a community, that you represent that community, is the first thing that a councillor needs to be doing. And what's happened in the system, because we haven't seen as much independent councillors, and we've seen so many come from parties, is that you find communities frustrated that parties have councillors who are first accountable to the party before they are to the community. And this is how democracy works. Democracy isn't about political parties primarily.
Yeah.
Democracy is about people. And those communities need to have a voice, and they need to be the priority for every councillor. So this is definitely a good development in our democracy.
All right, Tessa Dooms, a pleasure speaking to you. We'll certainly be chatting some more, I assume, during the week of elections. Thanks so very much for giving us your time once again here on SABC News.